So now we know how much we use in a car in a year. We know how much we use in an airplane for one trip, hopefully not for a weekend, but sometimes people do it that way. And now, next slide, we can talk about things like how do you get across the country? So compare flying across the country versus driving. If there's one person in a car versus 4 people in the car, and whether you have a Toyota Prius or a minivan. So I'm not going to work through these for you, but you could actually ask your students, does it make sense if you're alone to fly across the country? If you're going, if the choice is a minivan versus an airplane at 40 miles per gallon per person versus a minivan at 20 miles per gallon per person, you might argue, yes, it makes sense to fly from an energy perspective. It certainly makes sense to fly from a time perspective. But if you took a Prius and if it actually did get 50 miles per gallon cross country, maybe you'd come up with a different answer. So I've put in a few things here that I haven't fully answered for you, but if you're finding those to be interesting or you have students that might find them interesting, maybe you could pursue those. Next slide, please. But ultimately, we want to get to this question, well, how much is in the 8,000 kilowatt hours per year? So a kilowatt hour is 1,000 watts used for 1 hour. So if you had a 1,000-watt hairdryer and you ran it for an hour, you would use a kilowatt hour. If you had 10 100-watt light bulbs, or sorry, if you had one 100-watt light bulb and you used it for 10 hours, you would have used a kilowatt hour. So a kilowatt hour is an amount of energy. So that's something that my students, even on the day of the final exam, often ask me when I give something with watts. And they go, do you mean watts per minute or watts per second? And so a watt is a joule per second. It has a unit of time built into it. A kilowatt hour is a number of watts or thousands of watts used for so many hours, and it's a quantity of energy. So we can do this kilowatt hour is 3.6 megajoules, so 8,000 kilowatt hours times 3.6 megajoules per kilowatt hour gives you 28,800 megajoules. So that's the energy content in the electricity. It doesn't talk about how much energy was needed to generate that electricity, and as you know, it was a greater amount of energy to generate that, but that's our number. So next slide, please, Nicole. We can now say that a year of car travel used gasoline, which contained 52,800 megajoules. And at the bottom, a year of household electricity usage used 28,800 megajoules. And then just one round-trip airplane between New York and LA per person used 16,500 megajoules. So there's a lot of conclusions, I think, that you can reach on this, and I'll be interested in a few minutes in hearing from some of you. But one of the things that I observe is that while airplane travel might be more efficient than some cars, it's just so convenient and it's so easy that you can get greater distances in shorter amounts of time, that becomes a factor. When we started, I didn't know how many of you would know that the 400 gallons of gasoline versus 8,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. So in fact, the 400 gallons of gasoline contains more energy than 8,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. However, you're all thinking, well, how is that electricity generated? And so if it was generated with coal, or even, let's say, natural gas, if it was generated with natural gas, it was probably about a 50% efficiency. So there might have been, let's say, about 56,000 megajoules of natural gas energy content was put into a plant to convert to that much electricity. So you have to consider how much energy went into getting that much electricity. Same with the gasoline. You'd need to talk a little bit about how much energy went into extracting and recovering and transporting and refining the crude petroleum to make the gasoline. So these are not perfect comparisons. We're not doing a complete embodied energy from people sometimes say from cradle to grave, or from oil well to the wheel of a car. We're not doing a full assessment, but it gives you a snapshot of the energy content that we use. Next slide, please. So I think that those kinds of questions are good starting points, and I don't know if your students like to talk about the XL pipeline and talk about fracking, but one of the things that's been really interesting is that with the XL pipeline on hold, there's still oil making its way from the tar sands in North Dakota and Alberta, Canada, down to the southeastern United States to the oil refineries. It's just doing it in other ways. It's not going in a pipeline. It's going by train. So more and more trains are carrying oil. In fact, they're carrying less coal because we're doing more fracking and burning more natural gas and burning less coal in this country to generate electricity. So there have been numerous train accidents with freight cars containing oil. And so you certainly, I think, have a lot of stories you could pursue if you wanted to into the energy content of a freight train in terms of how much oil is on it and quantities, volumes, liters. So there are stories, but I find this a really interesting one, and it illustrates often the laws of unintended consequences. So as of now, and this is also what we tried to say about in our book, trying to be non-political or unpoliticized, without saying whether or not the XL pipeline is a good thing and whether or not it should be built or not. We are looking at the fact that with an XL pipeline not existing, oils are being extracted from tar sands, and they are finding their ways to refineries. And they find their way east to eastern Canada and the maritime provinces to an oil refinery there, or they're finding their way south to oil refineries in Texas and Louisiana. And they happen to be going now more frequently by train rather than by pipeline. So whether there's some good numbers there that you can uncover and set your students on in this last month before the AP exam, I don't know, but those are the kinds of things that I'm probably going to pursue because I'm teaching an energy course in the next 10 weeks, and so I'm going to be looking at some of those questions.